Welcome to the Jamesburg Presbyterian Church. Today is Tuesday, May the 18th, 2021. Today we're launching into a new study. It's a study on the Gospel according to Mark. And I was hoping to do this study, or I still expect to do it in about 9 weeks. It'll take that much time. Each installment will be a standalone installment so that if you don't see one, you won't miss everything. However, because we're recording these on YouTube and on Facebook, you can always go back and see an episode that you missed. I've often said to family and friends, those who tell the story first control the story. Usually the context of that saying is something has happened that maybe I was involved in or a person was involved in, and should I tell somebody what happened? Well, the answer is yes. You should always be transparent and honest. And if you tell the story first, you're probably going to be the one that's going to be heard first and heard best. And the person who comes in later on and tries to change the details may not be heard as well. This is what happened with the Gospel according to Mark. Mark is undoubtedly, and most scholars will agree with me, if not all of them, that Mark was written first. Mark tells the story first. He controls the story. There are a couple reasons why Mark did this. When he sat down to tell the story about Jesus, he did not think that he was starting a New Testament. He did not think that he was starting a new part of the Bible. He did not see his work as being a new Bible book. What he was doing was he was wanting to let future generations of Jesus followers know who Jesus was and what Jesus was all about. There are things that he needed to say. There are things that weren't as important. Mark uses an economy of words. He doesn't become repetitive. He doesn't say things that are not necessary to tell. Sometimes as we compare his gospel with Matthew and Luke, we see that he leaves out some detail from stories that maybe might have been helpful. Don't know why Mark did that. Again, he is a man of few words. The other thing we'll say about Mark is that he was probably writing for a Gentile audience by the time that he wrote, and this would have been around the time, somewhere around the time 68 to maybe 75. This would have taken place around the time of the insurrection at Jerusalem under a fellow by the name of Judas. It would have taken place after the fall of the city of Jerusalem, probably. And at that point in time, the world was in such turmoil that writing the story down was going to be critical. But to interpret those things against the context, the historical context in which he was living, would have been crucial. There are speculations that perhaps this Mark is one of the followers of Jesus. He might have been a person who was aware of the ministry of Jesus. It's probably not likely. There are some things that Mark does, and we're going to see that today in chapter 1, where he gets details wrong. If he had been following Jesus, if he had been one of the disciples, even there's a theory that he was a child who lived in the building that was the upper room that the disciples ate the Last Supper in. If he had been a child there and was aware of these things, that he should have gotten details, crucial details, correct. That's not the case. There are mostly geography details that he gets wrong. So collectively, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. If you cut the Gospels apart and lay them parallel to each other, we would see remarkable similarities, even in terms of grammar and bad sentence construction that Luke pulls from Mark, that Matthew pulls from Mark. But Matthew and Luke also have their own information that they use. So most everyone agrees that Mark was written first, and Mark was used as a source by both Luke and Matthew. One of the things that Mark, one of his themes is that the disciples do not really understand who Jesus is, especially in the beginning. They fail. They reflect a pure humanity, a humanity that at times has cowardice in it, a humanity that has uncertainty in it, a humanity that is sometimes clueless. Whereas Jesus reflects a divine connection. Jesus is in control of the circumstances. He isn't the one that's in control of the story. The first chapter, first verse reads as follows: "The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Some things that should remind us of, if we are in fact reading this and we have a good knowledge of the Old Testament. And I know that there are a lot of people who do not appreciate the Old Testament, but the word beginning should remind us of the book of Genesis in chapter 1, in verse 1, where God began something, a new creation. And the connection we should make with that first verse is that in Jesus, God is doing something new. God is creating something new. And if we were informed biblically about the Old Testament, we would be able to pull that knowledge into the New Testament at this particular point and come to that conclusion, which is exactly what Mark wants us to do. Mark tells us that Jesus is the Christ and that he is the Son of God. Some things that you need to know. In the time that Mark wrote, the word Christ meant anointed one. It did not, it could, and Messiah, also the Jewish version of that same word, meant anointed one. It did not necessarily mean somebody that was the Son of God, somebody that had divinity within them. What it did mean is that this is a person that has some special calling from God. God has sent this person into the world to do something very special. A king like David was considered to be the Messiah, the anointed one. And if he had been living during the Hellenistic period, he would have been called the Christ, the anointed one. So Messiah and Christ both mean that same word, anointed one. The Romans used that word to talk about the emperor. He was the anointed one, person who had a special calling to be who he was. Son of God also at this point in time does not necessarily mean incarnate. That will come later on in a development of Christology, that is the development of the theology of the Christ. But at this point in time, Son of God could also be a Roman term that was used of the emperor, someone who has authority, someone who God has especially chosen to do a particular work. So when Mark is writing, he is not talking about incarnation. If he was talking about incarnation, if that was his intent right now, then he would be telling us a Christmas story. He doesn't do that because at this point in which Mark is writing, the divinity of Jesus is unimportant. The messiahship of Jesus, that is, being anointed, is important, and that's why he tells us what he tells us. We're going to find out as we go through the entire Gospel of Mark that people will from time to time recognize Jesus as being anointed, as being someone sent by God. Certainly when he is baptized, Mark tells an abbreviated version of that story, but we're going to see there that there's a recognition that there's something very special about Jesus. The gospel was originally told in an oral tradition, and so it is important for Mark to now, as time is passing, as Jesus has not returned, as the oral tradition is becoming mixed and muddled, it's important for Mark to write these words down. Remember, the person who tells the story first controls the story. And Mark wants to control the story. He doesn't want it to get out of control. He doesn't want it to get out of hand. He doesn't want mythology brought into the story. He's going to tell the version of the story that he has collected, and he's going to control how he tells that story so that we will get the best version of the story and the greatest understanding of who Jesus is from him. Paul's letter, incidentally, also uses designation of Christ. And again, early on, Paul understood that word Christ as being anointed one. It becomes a title. It has a special dignity with God, but not necessarily as God at this point in time. During the ministry of Jesus, God will refer to Jesus at the baptism as beloved Son. The demons will recognize Jesus as the Son of God, again having a special connection to God, but not necessarily incarnate. All right. The next part of the gospel in chapter 1 is verses 2 through 8. And this is the story of John the Baptizer. And we often want to call him John the Baptist, his middle name being the and his last name being Baptist. But he should be called John the Baptizer. This is what his function is. Now, it's believed, and we get this from the gospel according to Luke, that John was a relative of Jesus, possibly a cousin, that his mother was Elizabeth, and that Mary and Elizabeth were related directly. Here, that connection is not made. But what we do know is that John was functioning as a prophet out in the wilderness. He's down by the Jordan River, and he is using the words of the prophet Isaiah. That's what Mark does, as one who is calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. So John is wearing clothing that is reminiscent of Elijah, and he has a diet of, where this would be repulsive, of insects and honey. This would be also reminiscent of Elijah and of the great prophets, people who did not affiliate with the cities, who did not become polluted by the things that went on in the cities. He is isolated out in the wilderness, and people are coming to him. Apparently, in this time period, there is already a spiritual hunger for people to connect with God somehow. They were not finding that hunger fulfilled by the temple cult in Jerusalem. They were not finding that fulfilled in the synagogue system in the cities throughout Israel. So they go out to John the Baptizer, and he baptizes them. Now, John's baptism is somewhat misunderstood. We usually get the idea that the water washes away the sin from the outer person. But really, that was not what John's intent was. That was a symbol of what should be going on within us. Sin is within us. We need to wash that sin from within us. And so the water becomes a symbol. Some people mistook it as, if I wash myself in this way, I will be clean. And that's not the case. John's baptism was for repentance, and it didn't need to be done more than once, but the reminder of that baptism should also compel us to give up the sinful habits that we have and try to lead that spiritual life. We're also told in Mark's gospel at the beginning that John the Baptizer is arrested. We're not told by whom. Is he arrested by the Romans? Is he arrested by the Jewish people? Is he arrested by the temple cult? We're not told, but we are told later on that he will be executed by Herod the Great. So somehow there is that connection that he ends up with Herod Antipas. Josephus is one of the ones. He's a Jewish historian writing in the first century, around the period of 70 A.D., and his story is a long and complicated, convoluted story that we'll not go into today. But he explained that John's preaching was to exhort people to an inner moral reform that was symbolized in that external ritual of baptism. The fact that Josephus reports about John the Baptizer authenticates John the Baptizer's existence. This is not, again, sometimes we think that some of these biblical characters were made up, that they fit into a story that works for the writer. The fact that Josephus is reporting on them, because Josephus is not a Christian, Josephus has no interest in trying to promote Jesus or anything having to do with Jesus. He has no interest in promoting John the Baptizer, but he does have an interest in reporting about the things that happened in Israel prior to the fall of the temple in 70 AD. So the fact that he reports on John the Baptizer authenticates John the Baptizer's existence. So from Josephus' perspective, only the inner moral reform constitutes forgiveness. So Josephus brings a theological interpretation to that baptism. The soul cannot be cleansed by a washing of the body, Josephus says. Mark's report that John's baptism was a vehicle for forgiveness. So actually Josephus develops or explains better what Mark describes. And it's close to the view that the people had. So people were going to John the Baptizer because they wanted that spiritual connection with God. They were looking for renewal, and they were not finding it within the Jewish faith. Later on, John will be imprisoned, and that will mark the beginning of Jesus' mission in Galilee, and that is brought to our attention in Mark chapter 1, verse 14. Later on in time, John the Baptizer will be executed, and his disciples will go and retrieve his body. There is some question as to whether John the Baptizer's disciples, his followers, continued John's ministry or joined up with Jesus' ministry. But Jesus goes to the Jordan River, and he is baptized, and we are told that. This story is told to us in verses 9 through 15. As Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. The wording or the translation that I just read is good because it wasn't that the heavens were just opening, the clouds parted. There was a kind of violent parting of the sky, so to speak. And even the descending of the dove, it would be more like crash landing on Jesus. This was a kind of violent thing that happened. And many people keen to believe, especially early on, that at this point Jesus was adopted as the Son of God, or that Jesus was seen as the closest thing being to what God wanted in a human being as you could possibly get. So early on, especially under Mark's influence, there is not an incarnational theology as much as there is an adoption theology. Once Jesus hears a voice, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." So this is kind of an adoption thing. At once he is sent out into the wilderness, into the desert, where he is tempted by the Satan, the adversary, for 40 days. Once again, if we were aware of the Jewish scriptures, we would know that Israel was in the wilderness being tempted for 40 years. After they fled from slavery in Egypt, they wandered in the desert for 40 years being tempted. So this is to parallel what happened to Israel. Jesus is becoming the new Israel in many ways. And we are not told, as in Luke and Matthew, what the temptations were. That story is better developed by those two Gospels. But we are told that he is with wild animals and the angels attended him. Wild animals, what is that about? Well, that should remind us of the Adam and Eve story. After the fall of Adam, there is enmity between the animals of creation and the humans. But at this point in time, we get the impression that Jesus is safe with the wild animals. There's no indication here that there's any kind of threat to him. So again, kind of a reminder of some Old Testament stories that if we were aware of, especially the book of Genesis and this at this point in time, we would be able to remember those stories and remember what they meant, their significance to the development of our theology about God. After John was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. The time has come, the kingdom of God is near. Repent and believe the good news. So this episode is not intended to supply information about the state of Jesus' own self-understanding, as though the encounter with John triggered Jesus' recognition of his special relationship with God. Rather, the episode continues the opening theme of prophetic fulfillment. In the New Testament, those with whom God is well pleased will play a role in the coming of salvation. The preaching assignment begins in verse 15. The end of John the Baptizer's ministry reminds the Christian of the fate awaiting Jesus. Things didn't go well for John. Can we expect at this part of the story to believe that things will go well for Jesus? It doesn't matter who arrested John, and maybe the ambiguity that Mark leaves us with that does get clarified in Matthew and Luke, maybe the ambiguity here is good in that it doesn't matter who arrested John. We just know that his fate didn't work out so well. And so we should have that ominous cloud over us as to what will happen to Jesus if we are reading this story for the first time. Mark does not indicate why John was arrested. He does not indicate who arrested John until he recounts John's death in chapter 6. John's death could be part of God's plan, but this interpretation is not confirmed at this point. All right, the next part of the gospel is verses 16 through 20, and this is a story of Jesus calling some disciples. For you and me, we've heard this story so often that it becomes ho-hum, kind of boring. So he calls some disciples. They left their boats, and they're going to become fishers of men. This would be the equivalent of you having a job, and Jesus walks by, and you quit your job on the spot, walk out of the building with your stuff from your desk, and you go off to follow an itinerant preacher with no certainty about the future. You don't know what the salary is going to be, and you have no way of sustaining your family at this point in time. You just gave up your job. You gave up your fishing business. These fellows who left their jobs weren't just leaving their jobs. They were leaving their boats. They owned the boats. They owned the nets. They left this stuff behind to follow Jesus. This is a big deal. This is not a small matter. Incidentally, this happened near a city that we usually call Capernaum. It should be called Capernaum, city of the prophet Nahum, Capernaum. I've been to Capernaum, and Capernaum kind of slopes down into the Sea of Galilee. It's on a hillside. At the top of the hillside is the remains of a synagogue. And the doorpost of that synagogue was given by James and John in memory of their father Zebedee. So that's again an authentication of people that we read about here. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, gave up their fishing business, walked out on their father, quit the family business to go follow Jesus. Hooks and nets, they left their hooks and nets behind. Usually these have a negative connotation of ensnaring people. We see this in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and Habakkuk. God sets traps for those who deserve punishment. In this case, they're being left behind so that these disciples can follow Jesus. This is an incredible disruption in the lives of some people and their families. They go to that synagogue at the crest of the hill in Capernaum, and there a man comes into the synagogue, and we are told he is possessed by an evil spirit. And the evil spirit says to Jesus, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One from God." We usually treat mental illness as an illness. We don't link it into a possession by a demon. Back in this time period, mental illness would have been seen as a possession by a demon. If we read this story today, we might say, well, isn't this silly? People weren't possessed by demons. But people can still become mentally ill. People can have problems and there's no medication to treat them. So if a person was bipolar, if a person was schizophrenic, those people would have been seen as people possessed by demons. Today we know that it's different, and we can treat those people. Back then it could not be treated. So this point of the story, exorcism stories serve a purpose, and usually the purpose of telling an exorcism story is to show a person's power over that kind of illness, and being able to restore a person to life again, to family again, to community again, was a really big deal. So this exorcism story shows that Jesus does have power to bring healing to people's lives, and does have power to restore people to their family and community. And that's the more important part of an exorcism. Of course, it's important to restore the person to themselves, to bring that clarity of mental health back to that person. But the bigger point of the story is the restoration of that person to the community and to their family, which becomes a kind of salvation. You're saving that person from the things that they are experiencing. In verses 29 through 45, the final part of chapter 1, Jesus goes to the synagogue, leaves the synagogue, and goes to the house where Simon's mother-in-law is living. I've been to that house. It's in Capernaum. It's about halfway down the hill from the synagogue to the Sea of Galilee, and the archaeological remains of that house are there. You can see it. The woman has a fever. Jesus heals her, and immediately she is able to rise. Word gets around from these two healings, and by the time evening comes, the house is surrounded by people who had various kinds of illnesses and problems. Everyone was expecting Jesus to make a difference. In the morning, Jesus gets up early, goes out to pray in a solitary place. In fact, we're told that he goes to the desert. Well, that's the problem, that one of the first problems that we find out. Near Capernaum, there was no desert. There was no isolated place like as Mark describes. So Mark apparently doesn't know that, or has been told, or has confused the story. but he certainly doesn't know the geography. And you'd think that he would get that right, since he's writing the story for people who likely will read this and maybe even go to these places to see them. We're told that he now goes to Galilee. Capernaum is not far from the Galilee region. He goes to the synagogues. He prays with people. He discovers a man who has leprosy. And the man says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. The man is not asking to be clean. He's making a statement of faith. I know that you can do this. If you are willing to do it, you can make it happen. And immediately Jesus brings cleansing to him. Leprosy was any kind of skin ailment. It was not necessarily a bacterial or a viral thing. It could have been psoriasis. It could have been poison ivy. It could have been a rash, the measles. I mean, whatever was wrong with your skin, that was called leprosy. And what happened is, if this cleared up, let's say that you had just a rash of some sort and it cleared up, you had to go to a priest, and the priest had to declare that you were clean. This is how it worked. Otherwise, you were not permitted to be with anybody, because this was considered to be contagious. So you could not be with your family. You could not be with your community. You had to wear torn clothes, and you had to tell everybody as you walked down the street that you were a leper. So once again, Jesus healing this man restores him to community, restores him to family, restores him to himself. And it doesn't matter what skin ailment he had per se. The fact of the restoration, the salvation that he experiences is important. So we should see these stories early on as kind of salvation stories. They're not the spiritual salvation that we will expect by the time we get to the end of the book, but they are salvific stories at this point in time. Now, Jesus is told, or Jesus tells the guy to go to, don't tell anybody what I did for you, but instead I want you to go out and talk to a priest. Have the priest declare you clean. This guy does not do that. What he does is he goes around telling everybody what Jesus did for him. And when an item that usually gets cleaned up in the translation, when the man comes to Jesus and asks him to clean him, in verse 41 we read, "Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man." The word for compassion, or the word that's translated from Greek to the English word compassion, does not necessarily, it can also be translated, Jesus is filled with anger. And people have wondered, why would that word be used? Why did Mark use that particular word? What would Jesus be angry about? And a couple possibilities. One, he's angry that people are still having to deal with illnesses. He's angry because of the societal structure that makes a person like this a reject of society, where you can't even be with your family and friends. Or is he angry that the religious system is set up so that if you are not declared clean, even if you are healed, if you're not declared clean by a priest, that you can not be reestablished within the community and within the family structure? Is this what Jesus is upset about? We're not told. I think it's an interesting thing. We could use the word compassion. I like the idea of angry, but we don't usually like to think that Jesus is angry, except unless it's a righteous anger, and could that not be the case here, a righteous anger? Mark has deliberately focused on the authority and identity of Jesus in telling this story. Later in the gospel, readers learn that scribes from Jerusalem refer to the exorcisms, refer to these miracle stories as evidence that Jesus is a magician, one who uses satanic power. Since accusations of practicing magic may lead to severe penalties, such as banishment or execution, the charge posed a threat to Jesus' life. Consequently, the command to be silent about this is an indirect way of indicating that such charges are false. In other words, the anger that Jesus may have is the fact that he knew that this man isn't going to listen. He's going to go out and tell everybody, which could expose Jesus to that kind of prosecution later on. Incidentally, Jesus did not come to the area to heal people. He came for a different reason. We're going to find that out. However, what is happening is there are healings going on. And these healing and the word about what Jesus is doing is spreading all over. As Christians today, we usually don't see mental illness or epilepsy, and epilepsy could have also been seen as a demonic possession. But we don't see these things as demonic possessions. We don't see them as a divine anger or a punishment. We are aware of the physical or emotional or mental problems that exist, and we treat them as medical or scientific issues. But sometimes there is a spiritual dimension to these kinds of things that also needs to be considered. And the gospel, according to Mark, reflects that over the science. It's not an either or, it's rather a both and. Next week, we'll pick up with where we left off. I would like to try to get through all of chapter 3, if that's possible. We shall see if that is possible. But at least today, we've gotten through all of chapter 1, 45 verses. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, I have a devotional plan for you. I hope you'll join us here during this time period. I think it's going to be exciting. Thank you very much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay well. See you soon. Bye.